Hi everyone. My name is Denise, and on behalf of Slocan Waterfront Restoration and Development Society, I want to thank you for coming out and give thanks to the land, the watershed we live in, and just acknowledge that we're in the traditional territory of the Sinites.
And just quickly here, most of you know Herb anyway, and it's my honor to introduce him briefly. Okay, so Herb, an RPF, a registered professional forester and forest ecologist. He holds a Bachelor of Science from Oregon State and a Master's in Forestry from the University of Washington. For 40 years he's worked in this field of forestry, and for about that long, I think, he's been our neighbor, friend, and advocate in Slocan Valley. Herb is a caring, wonderful human being, and consistent and persevering in his love for and protection of the forest. He continues to work for answers to the problems brought on by this clash between two very different species, two very special species, ourselves and the trees. And he also knows trees really intimately, which we'll see. And in his book, which some of you probably have, Seeing the Forest Among the Trees, he spells out exactly how we could make a holistic forest use for things. And that was an award-winning book. He's also an ecosystem conservationist and did a bunch of planning for the boreal forest. His new book about Galiano Island in the process is about, it's entitled From Old Growth to Clear Cut and Back Again. So it would be great to hear that. Also, an ecosystem-based approach to managing forests in cities. So Herb has been everywhere, and it's been great that he comes back. As many of you know, and probably already have, this came out in the 70s. This is the, many of you know this map. Herb might talk about it a little bit. That was his ecosystem-based plan for the Slocan Valley. How many of you remember that map? Oh yeah, okay.
There's a copy of the back.
A couple, and there's a few extra books too for purchase. There's one other thing, yeah, so he mostly works with Indigenous and other rural communities and has developed over 25 of these ecosystem-based plans in Canada and in other parts of the world. Finally, he's working now with a Haida artist, Nicole Yadulanias. We'll see some pictures maybe from this, about how to be a respectful part of forests in the global changing world of this climate. So that'll be the focus of his talk. So with much respect, that was my inadequate attempt to introduce Herb Hammond.
So what I want to do tonight is kind of summed up on the screen there. I want to talk about forests and then contrast that with forestry with a dose of climate change, because climate change is the issue of our times, and it affects everything, and because it affects everything, it means we should change everything, almost everything anyway, and we're not doing a very good job of that. And I'll give you a few suggestions through a planning system that we call ecosystem-based conservation planning about how we might do that. Ecosystem-based conservation planning in and of itself has kind of a humorous story, because when I wrote my first book in 1991, I called it Holistic Forest Use, and it was uniformly decried by professional associations and industry and government and things like that. And then about 4 or 5 years later, I picked up a government pamphlet and it said, "We do holistic forestry." And I very quickly learned that it was way easier to change the image than it was to fix the problem. And so they complete with words like sustainability that have been so thoroughly co-opted through the years. And so then we started doing what we called ecosystem-based management, and we got the same kind of response. This was nonsense, but when we put out the science and explained to people what needed to be done, lo and behold, that's what we do. And so my third and perhaps final attempt was to stick the word conservation in there, and that hasn't quite been picked up yet. It may be just a little too severe for the system. So whenever you start in a forest, you need to start with water. And water always starts with drops. I want you to remember that, because whether you're talking about a drop on that maple twig or whether you're talking about drops on this Douglas fir leaves in a small section of a Douglas fir tree, that's where it starts. And that's where we need to start in our thinking about how we protect water, which basically weaves a web in a forest ecosystem that we spend a lot of time tearing apart. Sometimes we're not even aware that we're tearing that web apart, but we are. It's so easy to miss little things like this when you think about or are part of any ecosystem, but particularly forest ecosystems that have so much vertical and horizontal complexity in them. And their size makes it very difficult for us to relate to them. We don't see the small things very well, and you need to be a hummingbird or an eagle to start appreciating the landscape and the impacts that we have on it in places where we can see. These are watersheds. Watersheds are the basic unit that water collects in. You can look at a crease in your hand, and just like that crease in your hand, every crease on the face of the earth is a watershed, and the whole earth is a watershed. So very quickly you understand that they add together. They're a geometric kind of formula in an ecological sense that collects, manages, protects, purifies water. So these big valleys you can easily see as a basin, but each one of these little side valleys is another basin, and they have a myriad of side valleys to them. So when you start talking about watershed management, you have to start at that drop, and then you have to go work upwards as you look at all of that interconnected web that makes up the watersheds of Earth. Water's the veins and arteries of the Earth. We know that when we put blockages in river systems or stream systems, we have repercussions. The most classical example of that around the world are dams, hydroelectric dams. I mean, this river was once full of salmon, not that long ago. 1930, there were lots of salmon in the Slocan River, and today there are none. The biggest reason for that is Grand Coulee Dam and other dams in the system. But think about it this way. We are all told, especially as we get older, you beware of blockages in the veins and arteries, that's not good for you. And it's interesting to me how we can accept that as part of our individual ecosystem and not grasp that as part of Earth. So now I want to go back to the drops for a minute. I want to go back to thinking about how those drops work in a forest. This is a picture of an intact forest. It happens to be an old-growth Douglas fir forest in the Cascade Mountains of Oregon. But we used to have lots of those forests here. We used to have lots of those forests across British Columbia and around the world. We have a dearth of them right now. I'll speak to their importance a little bit more, but they do the best water conservation, manage water the best of any ecosystem or ecosystem phase. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but chief amongst them are there are millions of leaves on one of those big trees. And each one of those leaves manages the drops. They manage the physical intensity of them. They contribute to the chemistry of them. They purify the water. And so big trees like that are by far the best way to take care of water. And then we can start thinking about climate change. Each one of those big needle, or of those leaves or needles on those big trees is a photosynthesis factory. It takes carbon dioxide and water in the presence of sunlight and turns it into stored carbon in the forms of carbohydrates and sugars that we would recognize readily as wood in these trees. So again, they're the best at doing that. No other ecosystem, no other terrestrial ecosystem sequesters and stores carbon better than an old-growth forest. The older the forest, the better it does it. And they have the highest level of biological diversity. Somewhere around 80%, 82% plus or minus of the mammals that we are used to knowing about in British Columbia need old-growth forests at some time in their either annual or lifetime at some point for breeding, for foraging, for raising young, etc. So they play really critical roles. Keep in mind that we may not have a shortage of trees, but we have a growing shortage of intact forests. There should be alarm bells ringing all over the place about that. Water is also alive, and if we treated it like it was alive rather than a commodity that is just always there in our system, we would react to it differently. You can think of water being alive from a spiritual standpoint. Many indigenous cultures see water as the starting point for life in the womb of the mother, and they talk about not north and south, but they talk about upstream and downstream. And so water is very alive in spiritual ways, but it's also very alive when we think about it biologically or physically. There's a real simple thing to know, which probably most of you do. We're either about 70% water or we're not here. So if water is not alive, then I don't know what is. I guess that means we're not alive either. And yet I struggle, and I'm next week going to a meeting that I have pushed for with a timber company that manages the tree farm license in this valley over water, over the fact that it's treated like it's a commodity. We can change and alter all these things we're talking about, and the water remains the same. No. So we can take from that water may either transmit the essence of life, or it may magnify and transmit our mistakes. That really is what the options are. All we need to do is look around us in this valley and elsewhere to see those mistakes. So this is another look at watersheds. This is a boreal system, and it has beautiful fall colors in it. Trust me, that's a little strange color there tonight. But the interesting thing here is watersheds. You can see in flatter systems are much more subtle. And that subtlety, the reason I include that is managing that subtlety is a big problem. We remember what I said about every little crease. Well, when you log an area, you log whole watersheds. They're small, yes, but we get ourselves caught in a trap of saying there are inconsequential effects of that. And maybe if we only did that once or twice, scattered through a larger watershed, that would be true. But that isn't what's happened. So we need to manage watersheds at all of the scales we've been talking about. And the three variables to imprint on your mind about what you're going to manage and what you're going to protect are water quality, quantity, and timing of flow. Three simple things, three parameters. But I would make the observation that in the watersheds in this valley and in the watersheds of most of BC that have been licensed away for other uses, we don't even have any baseline information of quality, quantity, and timing of flow. That's a convenient situation if you want to exploit them, because then you end up putting people like the people in this room and the people in all communities in a negotiation with one hand tied behind your back, because you don't have the baseline information necessary to articulate the change. Indigenous cultures do better in that regard than ours because they don't have to have scientific studies. They have observation-based knowledge that is passed down orally through time. And that provides a really good record of things like water quality, quantity, and timing of flow. And hopefully we will use some of that knowledge. So if we do it right, then water is the priority, and things like timber, minerals, tourism, urban development, those are byproducts. Those are byproducts of taking care of water. They're byproducts of taking care of water. If we did that in how we approached how we relate to Earth, we would do almost a 180 in how we treat this planet and the ecosystems that make it up. But here's what's going on today in our valley. I have the unfortunate distinction of being able to see this out my window, at least when the cottonwoods are not in leaf. I always like to see the riparian ecosystem come back there. But that's a clear cut in a headwaters watershed with a very aggressive yarding corridor that goes down almost to the creek. I've been told by the people that designed it that it has no influence on the water. I'll let you make up your own mind on that as we go along here and talk a little bit more about it. So let's bring climate change into the picture. There's no lack of consensus that our actions have caused climate change. And how climate change manifests itself around the world will be different in different places for different reasons. Here, though, this is a pretty good formula. Warmer, drier, drought equals forest stress. That's going to lead to ecosystem shifts and even ecosystem collapses. We're going to see, for example, there's this tension. You think about, we live in an inland rainforest, and the cedar hemlock forest that we're used to at lower elevations and mid elevations, you can theorize that as the upper elevations, the subalpine, where there are Engelmann spruce and balsam fir being two of the dominant species, that they're going to move upslope and that we'll lose a lot of Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir. That's a nice theory, but trees don't genetically change that fast, nor do they have legs that can walk up the hill. And we're busily punching holes, perforating that with how we treat that landscape, and plants can't move effectively through those perforations. So we're gonna see things that we can't even really imagine today. We can see the start of it, but we don't know. Increased fire is another major part of the problem. Warmer, drier, how I started out tonight. I mean, I walk around in the 7-acre valley bottom forest where we live, and it feels really spooky to me right now. There's more and more research coming out about how fires are becoming more intense. There is a new discovery after some of the huge fires here in Washington State and elsewhere in the world about how these big mega burns create their own thunderstorms. And those thunderstorms can spread embers for up to 10 kilometers or more that start more fires. So when we think about the danger of fire and the fact that if fires are repeated year after year after year, which they can be, then you can see really quickly how you start having not only forest stress, but ecosystem collapse from it. The systems just can't recover. And we're going to look at decreased water supplies. It's not, all of those things do a number on those drops where we started, and on a number of when it comes to intact systems and what we call the composition and structure, how they function. So conventional forestry is going to magnify, not going to, is magnifying climate change impacts. There's no doubt about that, and I'll give you some more information about that in a moment. Here's tree farm license number 3. This is in the Little Slocan River, the Little Slocan Lakes, for those of you who know them. They're over here, and in the valley bottom. We're looking kind of south there at the back of Perry Ridge on Tedesco Creek, or just north of Tedesco Creek. That really is a good example of lost opportunities. We have changed forests into clear cuts and tree plantations. We based that on theories that have no sound basis in science. A little bit of selective science. It's interesting what you could do if you sponsor chairs in universities and how you can shape research and then use a little bit of research to make what I call assumptions of convenience. So that's contributing to climate change. Think back to that intact forest I showed you. Think back to the millions of leaves on those trees, the big stems that store carbon, and they will store that carbon for centuries, some of them, depending on where they are, millennia. So really, what's happening in the Little Slocan River is happening in forests throughout BC and around the world, across Canada. Some of you have probably read this in the news. There's all kinds of scientific studies coming out daily about the fact that we've turned our forests from carbon sinks to carbon sources. And that should be a big warning to us, because you know what? There's a lot more forests than there are automobiles. Keep that in mind. I'll come back to that in a moment. So this is a picture that that could have been taken out my bedroom window of successive droughts that are pushing forests to tipping points. I lost that cedar. I live in a pretty wet riparian ecosystem, at least moist on the gradient of things. But we're annually having successive droughts, It's not, are we having a drought? It's the degree of drought that we have annually. And a forest ecosystem, the trees, the plants, the soil microbes, the whole system, after 1 year of drought, needs 4 years of normal precipitation and weather to recover. We don't get that anymore. And if you ask me where does that lead, about the only thing I am sure of is that I think it leads somewhere we don't want to go. And it's a scary thing when you think about it that way in terms of what we've unleashed. Now I want to kind of connect this a little bit to logging. But let's step into a snowy picture here and talk a little bit about water, forests, and logging. We live in a snow-dominated ecosystem, and so it's a little easier to see what I'm going to explain to you. But the same thing is true in rain-dominated ecosystems. And we may very quickly be a rain-dominated ecosystem in the winter. We're headed that way. But in a normal Kootenai winter, in snow-dominated ecosystems, about 30 or 40% of the snow that falls on the crowns of these big trees is either evaporated by sunlight, evaporated by wind, or sublimated by wind and sunlight, which means it just goes from a snow to a gas without passing through the water state, and is moved up into the atmosphere and moved somewhere else. That's a really important part of managing those drops, and it's a really important part about avoiding overloading of water. In fact, if you think about it, and now go to that rain-dominated ecosystem on the west coast of British Columbia and Vancouver Island, Haida Gwaii, up and down the mid-coast, that was the first kind of interception from precipitation and evaporation coming off of oceans and air movement around the world. That's the first place that the precipitation, the clouds are raised, condense, rains. 30 or 40% of that rain gets leapfrogged to the montane or the mountains, across the mountains, and eventually to the prairies. So that system, that function of forests going all the way back to that drop, now looking at a big landscape, is that the interception of moisture, whether it's rain or snow, and moving it across continents is not just responsible for the water where you live or where you might be standing, but it's responsible for global movement of precipitation. There now is evidence, for example, that comes out of the US that precipitation at one time that came from the west coast along the Oregon, Washington, California coast of the US was moved as far as almost the east coast in Canada. And it was done through this kind of subtle water system. Okay, how does that relate to logging? Well, all that 30 to 40% of the snow or rain that was intercepted and moved now falls on the ground. And so you end up with 30 or 40% snowpacks, deeper snowpacks, or 30 or 40% more rain that you have to manage, quote unquote, or that the forest has to deal with in those places where you cut. That slowly changes as trees grow in those openings. There's no doubt about that. But the emphasis is on the word slowly, because we're back to the drop. You've got to have as many needles, which means not only height of trees, but crown density, how long the limbs are, how many leaves are there before you get back to that state. So a really important thing to keep in mind. This is a big factor in spring floods and fall droughts, and one that's not pretty. So this can be explained basically in another way, too. For each degree Celsius that we warm the Earth, there's 7% more water in the atmosphere through evaporation. That's part of why the forest floor is so dry this time of year. UV radiation, evaporation, moving that out of the forest floor. So there are now, depending on, as you know, likely from some of the recent climate change emergency reports that are being put out by very credible scientists, that we, for all intents and purposes, are definitely 1.5 degrees warmer. We're, in many cases, 2 degrees warmer already if you're talking about the Yukon and further north in Canada. And Environment Canada tells us that our winters are on average 3 degrees Celsius warmer than they used to be. So that means we've got about maybe as much as a quarter more water up there in the atmosphere. That water has been described by climate scientists as rivers of water, literally, flowing through the sky. And that adds up to more intense storms. Think back to the recent flood events that have happened much more frequently in this valley than used to happen. Think about the Johnson's Landing slide. Think about the fact that when it rains now, it's like somebody turned a hose on your head as opposed to something more gentle. And we talked about that. Deeper snowpacks melt faster. That results in spring floods. And that timing of flow, remember water quality, quantity, and timing of flow. Well, the timing of flow, a whole bunch of it happens in the spring, and then there isn't snow and water-charged systems to make it up in the fall, so we end up with fall droughts. So we're back to another challenge here for forestry. We need to do something different. This is about a kilometer upstream from where I live. I could tell you many stories about this. The most frustrating thing to me is that I have tried for 2 years to find a civil servant to talk to and am willing to work cooperatively to fix this. I still haven't found anyone. I could tell you stories that on the surface are funny, and behind my back it makes me cry. Like, you know, I phoned the Ministry of Environment. Oh, we don't have anything to do with that. Do you have a hydrologist? No, there's one in Victoria. Well, can you tell me how to get in touch with them? No, I can't. You know, you'll have to phone, what is it called? Information BC? That's not quite right. Anyway, Services BC, yeah. And so I phone Services BC and find out that I'm talking, and this nice person, I explained to her, and she says, well, that's a pretty reasonable request, but I don't have any information to help you. And so when I poured out my heart a little bit, she said, you know, I'm a contractor, and I hear this every day. And so our civil service has been hijacked, you know? I mean, it is literally, it's not just in a landslide issue, it's everywhere in it. I mean, there used to be a phone directory. Remember that? Used to say Nelson Forest Region. You could pick it up. There's the regional manager, phone number, name, things like that. You try to find that. You might be able to find little pieces of that. Find a phone number? Oh, no, we don't want you to have a phone number. I mean, that would be bad. You know, you'd have to talk to the plebeians out there. So anyway, I told you, don't get me started on this landslide. Let's talk about it from an ecological standpoint. This is a function of two things. It's a function of those intense storms that I told you about. What you see up there is Scott Carlson's property. Their house used to be, Scott and Chris's house used to be right on the edge there. They did move it back. But this has slid twice. And that's what's called a came terrace. And they're all over this valley and all over glacial landforms. When this valley was full of ice, as the glacier receded and the ice melted, all of the sediments and rocks and boulders and sand and gravel that were locked up in that glacier ran off the sides. And not surprisingly, it took more water to push the boulders off than it did to push the sand off, than it did to push the silt off. So those ran up against the granite walls of this valley and many other valleys, and they are stratified. So you end up with layers of sand, layers of silt, layers of clay, layers of boulders, depending on what the glacier was doing and how that was arranged in the glacier. So they're well known as unstable landforms because when water percolates down into them and hits a water impermeable layer like clay, it will run along that and saturate if you get too much water. And because they tend to be beyond their angle of repose, they go boom, like that. And that's exactly what you can see in that photograph. So that was caused by an intense storm that is definitely a result of climate change. And it's been exacerbated year after year by the fact that the Little Slocan River drainage basin has been vastly overcut by Interfor. They haven't gotten back to big enough trees to manage the water while we're still taking the rest of them out. And so that results in those spring floods, which keeps undercutting the toe of this slide. And so you're over-steepening it. Each time you do that, you take a chunk out and you've got that steep face again, and those particles, the only way they can accommodate that is to go boom again. So logging is a big issue that we need to deal with. Some of the indicators of the need for change when it comes to logging and forestry are the annual carbon released from logging in Canadian forests is greater than all the carbon from all the cars in Canada. I'm going to hit that one again, so I won't say much more than that right now. This one always, I think, surprises people that up to 60%, and now more recent research says 65% of the carbon in a log is back in the atmosphere within 5 years from the time the tree is cut. Why? We always think about long-term storage of carbon in wood products. Well, there's a lot of manufacturing, sawdust, bark, a lot of waste that gets either directly left behind, sometimes burned, that contributes to that. And you know what? More than 50% of what's in Canada's landfills are house parts. We have disposable houses, probably not for most of us in this room, but across this country, it's a huge amount. So you not only lose the carbon storage there, but when you bury it in landfills, it makes methane, which is something in the order of 20 to 40 times as powerful a greenhouse gas as CO2. Not as long lasting, but a real big issue. And if you look at the forests around here, and temperate rainforests, and even really our montane forests, you can apply this number to. After you log these forests, it takes around 250 years to get back to the same level of carbon sequestration or capture and storage. So in a boreal forest, it's a little shorter, but now, if you've ever read a forestry plan or talked to a forest manager, you probably know the term rotation age. Rotation age means that that's how old the trees are going to be when they get cut down again. We conveniently have forgotten about the fact that we inherited all this from the Great Spirit, from nature, and we have forests that range in age in boreal systems from 200 or 250 years to temperate rainforests that are over 1,000. But how do you get at that? From the standpoint of capitalism and money, well, you say a tree's mature when it's 80 years, and those forests that took 250 years to grow, we're going to cut them down as though they grew in 80 years. So that's how an 80-year rotation is developed. Think about that. We're talking about going from, since I can see lots of gray hair in this room, I can say this, from elders and in a forest sense, to growing only juveniles, early juveniles, before we cut them down again. You lose a huge amount of functioning and a huge amount of ecosystem services, which has become the buzzword for water, air, carbon storage, et cetera. So we need to rethink that one too.